Wilton and Steve.
All right, so I will share my screen and we will walk through some of our slides here. Okay, you guys see a nice purple opening slide?
Yep.
All right, so today we have a pretty packed agenda and we're gonna make you guys work a bit. So I hope you're ready, mostly just to get your ideas, get your feedback. The main sort of the body of this, we're just going to be going through kind of our interpretation from all of what we've sort of heard from you guys, from what we've heard from public input, from stakeholder interviews, and our own just observations in the area, sort of our take on sort of existing distinctive character areas. So areas that have sort of either like physical features or use features that make them a little bit different from what's right next to them. This doesn't mean that these are going to be the zoning districts, but it's sort of a starting point for us to say, this is how we understand sort of the waterfront and the dynamics along the waterfront. And it'll be the way that we begin to put forward proposals or scenarios that relate to those existing character patterns that we're noticing. So just sort of to keep it fresh, sort of there's four things that this planning process is really touching on. The first is vision, which is kind of the big picture, like what's sort of the overall thing that we're going for. The next piece is policy, which is one piece of implementation. So that's rezoning and harbor management plan, potentially if need be, economic development, and then capital investment. So those kind of, they all are in lockstep ideally, but we're starting with the vision. That's kind of where we're at now, and we'll extend through to each of them. So
Laura, sorry, please run that by me again. What were you planning to change, or you develop a harbor management plan? What was that?
No direct changes to the harbor management plan, only a note that sort of anything that is related to zoning should be coordinated with the harbor management plan, right? So if at the end of this process, we collectively think it makes sense to make some small adjustments to the harbor management plan, that would be something that might be worth discussing, but it's not at all the focus of the plan. We know that you guys have put a lot of work and a lot of sort of research and time into that, so that's our intention is not to mess with what you've already put together. Okay, so in terms of timeline, we're kind of in a really fruitful period right before our public meeting, which is set for January 18th. And what we're doing, this is the first of two workshops, hopefully to basically go through with you what we're thinking before we take it to the public to get their input. And the scenarios themselves will really reflect kind of four different pieces that are sort of mirroring the items that I talked about earlier. So public access and capital investment plan, that'll be something that sort of gets tied into this this effort. Flood resiliency and water quality, whether that's in terms of physical projects or in terms of policy that relates to like standards around those things. Economic development and fiscal strategy, so zoning is inherently kind of related to that, so we'll be thinking about that as we're coming up with scenarios. And then finally, the sort of most straightforward of it, which is the sort of rezoning recommendation. So again, these things are all kind of tied into one another. And what we're doing today is really sharing with you our interpretation about these different character areas, sort of the patterns of the waterfront, and then validating with you if you feel like we've captured the key issues and opportunities for each of those character areas. And this will be kind of the basis of the scenarios that we then come up with those things in mind. So for this workshop, what we're going to basically do is walk you through what we have developed so far, and then ask you to kind of jump in and make comments directly. And you can either do it verbally or sort of physically. So we have like basically a whiteboard similar to what you might like if we were in person. We might have boards up that you could kind of put sticky notes on and write on. This is sort of a digital equivalent, and we'll kind of do this with you, so you don't need to learn something new all at once. But if you feel comfortable, you should feel free to work in it directly. Once we're in the board, I'll kind of walk you through the details of it, but you should just be able to kind of move around it, make comments directly, and then that'll be kind of our record of the meeting and your input. So without further ado, I'll kind of walk you through our interpretation. So the main things that we looked at were kind of fourfold. So first, we looked at sort of existing barriers, so physical things that were defining district edges. So that's everything from topography to infrastructure like rail and highway, and then sort of the road network itself, the surface streets. Typically those things sort of help to define edges for sort of zoning districts, but also just for character areas. We also looked at hydrology, so the level of flood risk and the amount of coverage of it for any given area, and how much impervious surface, or the degree to which that flood risk is coinciding with impervious surface. We then also looked at the use of the water, so in particular in terms of public ownership and waterfront access. And then finally, the development analysis, which really looked at what's the current land use, what are the current zoning districts. Those things aren't exactly the same. So land use is sort of the way the land is being used right now, and zoning is what is allowed to happen on the land, whether or not it's what's happening now. And then we also looked at sort of the parcel fabric, so how big, what shape, and the types of buildings that were in each of these areas. And this won't come as a surprise for any of you being familiar with Norwalk, but there's a pretty dramatic topographic change from sort of the first roads in some of the areas down to the waterfront itself. And in some places, in this case, we're looking at kind of near the inner harbor, cutting through some of the industrial area and up to East Avenue. That grade change is almost one full sort of like the first floor of a building. It's about 12 feet. So it's significant, and it affects the way that people perceive sort of the edges of different areas. And then oftentimes we're also seeing the land use itself shifts along with that topographic change, relative to kind of the uplands versus the lowlands. That's just kind of as a broad interpretation. That's sort of the preface to this, which is looking at the contour lines throughout the whole study area, and really looking at places where they're really tight up against each other. That's where you see a really steep drop off, and those places are sort of edges, that define sort of shifts in the districts. You also see the rail lines coming through here, and the highway coming through here, as well as the sort of state bridge here. Another layer, like I mentioned, that we looked at is the hydrology. So you're seeing the 100-year floodplain here, with the sort of blue boundary at the edge, and then in gray, impervious surfaces. So you can see that there's some areas where those are overlapping considerably.
Zoe, question about that.
Yeah.
Is 100-year floodplain adequate? Or should we be looking at something more like a 500-year floodplain, given how frequently we have these 100-year events?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So typically, the 100-year is something that, like you mentioned, is at this point for many places happening frequently. It's sort of something that's part of the everyday planning for operations. The 500-year floodplain is absolutely an important boundary to be planning around. And there's honestly, for flood risk planning in general, there's a lot of uncertainty because the FEMA floodplain doesn't yet incorporate climate change projections. So this is kind of the most conservative thing that we can put forward and say, this we should absolutely be planning for. This is very real, very immediate risks that any reasonable business owner might want to think about, any sort of resident might want to think about. Whereas sometimes when you get into the 500-year floodplain and beyond, there's a little bit more kind of controversy around whether or not we should be planning for it. I think our general posture is that it makes sense to plan for sort of more intensive flooding than the 100-year, but this is kind of a baseline. In terms of water use, we looked at where there's existing pathways as well as planned or proposed pathways, and also where that coincided with public ownership versus private ownership. So this is coming from sort of city level data about sort of intended bike network and pedestrian networks. And you can see that there's a broad range of the degree of public access proposed in different parts of the study area. And then finally, in terms of development analysis, we looked at, like I said, the patterning of the parcels, the buildings, and then also, what types of uses were on each of these different, pieces of property within the study area. And really what that added up to, as we kind of compiled all 4 of those together, is these are the 19 kind of sub districts that we're seeing within the study area. These are sort of a mixture of those sort of natural features and sort of infrastructure features that create boundaries, as well as shifts in the land use character, shifts in the parcel fabric, shifts in sort of the urban relationship and the sort of the character of the streets. So this is something that sort of is the DNA or the sort of the skeleton that we're then going to be thinking about for looking at the scenarios for these different areas. And when you kind of overlay that with existing land use, this is, maybe a helpful way to kind of distill it a little bit to think about, what are the sort of open space, institutional and open space areas. Those are shown in green here. Areas that are sort of either office use or marine commercial are shown in the red. And then you see kind of more traditional mixed use shown in orange. The public sector, sort of public industrial services are shown in the dark blue. And then we have sort of lighter industrial, heavier industrial, and kind of mixed residential and industrial here. So this is kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of, regardless of the zoning district, kind of what is the pattern of use on the waterfront now.
Yeah, I think between the barriers that Zoe talked about, the different land uses, and that each of those sub areas are kind of a world unto themselves. It's a very diverse, and because of the change in topography, right? There's the highlands and the lowlands that are floodable or not. If you are walking around any of those sub areas, they're like nothing like the one next to them, and that is kind of remarkable about this assignment. There's not a general one size fits all solution, obviously. It's almost complex as a city in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely one of the things that stood out to us in looking at this waterfront in comparison to some others that we've worked on, where there is kind of larger swaths of sort of similar character areas. And in this case, there's really a lot going on. And so we really wanted to honor that variety with sort of site-specific considerations. Any thoughts on this before we jump into sort of things that are more specific to these individual areas?
So if you look at area 17 and 18, it's marine industrial.
Yep.
What makes a differentiation between 17 and 18?
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
it the type of existing buildings that are there now?
It's also the depth of the parcels too, John. Okay. In 17, like from Water Street, you're right at the water's edge. And so it's, what those parcels are currently, what they could be, is very different than 18, where you have almost like a transect from Water Street to the water where, there's more land, those are long, narrow parcels. That's really the only major reason. I think also 17 is just closer to the, the action, right at the kind of commercial action right there at that key intersection.
Yeah, agreed. At least part of it.
Yeah.
Have you guys in your due diligence spoken to DEEP?
We've looked at, we're sort of familiar with a lot of the regulations from them. We haven't had a direct meeting with them thus far, but the city has a lot of sort of ongoing contact with them. So we've been sort of leaning on that thus far. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, Zoe, but I have spoken with Marcy from DEEP specifically about this project. We've sent her the materials that have come live as they've become available.
Laura, I'm sorry, who'd you speak with? I'm sorry, I missed the name.
Her name's Marcy.
Oh, Marcy Balin. Marcy Balin?
Yep, and so we've sent her the materials as they've become live, but as you know, there aren't any recommendations yet, so we could only just show her the study area and say what regulations potentially fall in this area, which she sent us documentation on, which then we passed along to Zoe, so that's what Zoe's had a chance to read that she's referencing, but we also have spoken with Marcy from Deep.
Well, keep in mind that they're very sensitive to putting, residential, facility into floodplain, close to coastal floodplain area.
Absolutely. Yeah, as are we. So we'll definitely, I mean, as we get closer to the recommendation stage, we'll definitely be working really closely with them to make sure that both we're not proposing anything that they feel is irresponsible in terms of sort of the land use mix that they'd like to see along the water, but also just to make sure that it's sort of in sync with their approach in general. So we'll absolutely make sure that that's continuing to happen. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump into talking about some of the sort of specific observations that we have for each of these areas, which includes sort of, John, to your question about the distinction between 17 and 18. That's some of the stuff that we'll start to talk about. So in this section, we kind of went through, we'd love to hear back from you about sort of our analysis, if there's anything that you feel like we're missing or misinterpreting, factors that should be included in this sort of analysis phase, and then also kind of issues and opportunities. Same thing, are we missing or misinterpreting any key issues? Are there opportunities that you feel like we're missing, that we should be calling attention to? So this is going to kind of go in reverse clockwise order, coming from the east side, starting at Veterans Memorial Park, moving along the waterfront and then back out. So we'll close out with the sort of marine commercial along Water Street. And as a sort of broad note, we haven't gone in detail into any of the open space ones, because that is the sort of the purview of the Parks Department. There's a lot of other sort of factors involved in those. And we're really focusing on the areas where there's sort of private development, where there's other uses that are non-open space uses. So for this section, the barrier analysis was really stark. It's right, sandwiched right in between the two bridges. Has sort of limited access via the road network. So that's sort of a sort of defining feature of this area. It also has significant flood risk. You can see kind of in this area, covers, almost the entire area. Public, ownership is, just about the whole area, again, with a small pocket here of sort of private use. And so with that in mind, there's sort of an intention to have the, public waterfront access in this area. And there's, uncertainty about, what the future use is of this area here, which is currently zoned neighborhood business. That's the area that's being used for the staging area. So that's kind of the biggest question for this piece of the study area is the future of that sort of parcel and how it relates to the current open space and trail network. For the East Bank Public Services, this is sort of the, both where the wastewater treatment plant is and also Public Works. It already has a trail along the outside edge. It's mostly flat land with a couple of sort of consolidated topographic shifts that really are meant to protect the whole site from any flooding. You can see that there is still some flood risk, but it's more so in the Public Works part of the site, which is on the right side here versus the left, which is where the wastewater treatment facilities are consolidated. Obviously, just about all public ownership except for the rail right of way. And then it's all currently zoned industrial number 1 and has sort of a series of industrial outbuildings for the most part. The East Bank Marina pocket, this is sort of just in the sort of nook here between the industrial public services and the highway. And this is despite sort of mostly being water dependent, marinas, boat clubs, they have different zoning for the two different areas, even though the uses are pretty similar. And in terms of topography and kind of barrier analysis, the thing that's sort of distinctive about this area is that the streets dead end into the water, basically. So instead of having like a periphery road, like a lot of other areas of the waterfront, there's just sort of view corridors that sort of look out into the water. And the land use transition happens just about at the end of each of those streets. There is public access along just about this whole stretch already. And the flood risk is sort of limited. So, not a huge concern for this area. The East Bank Office Park, this is dominated by the sort of current health office building, and then also has St. Anne's Club. It has significant flood risk, covering most of the sort of current parking lot area. It's generally sort of flat land until you kind of hit this, access road going up towards East Avenue. The public waterfront, use and access, there's a little bit along St. Anne's Club, but the area that sort of is around the edge of the parking lot is currently not built, although it is proposed. And the sort of the current land use mix is really dominated by that health office building, like I mentioned, and then the marina or the club use. This next area is basically lining East Avenue, carrying it from roughly the highway through to the CBD. And this area is one of the most dramatic topographic shifts in a short sort of distance. And so there's a real sort of dual face to a lot of the parcels. So they face on East Avenue, but they also face on the water. And there's sort of a different character in those two different orientations of each parcel. The flood risk is really minimal, again, because the topography is really dramatic. So it sort of contains flood, but there might be a risk of there being higher, deeper floods in those first little bits of each of the parcels. The public access is mostly in place in this stretch. And in terms of land use, it's currently a mix of residential, office, and sort of commercial industrial uses. A lot of these are residential style buildings that are being used as offices. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. For this little pocket here is pretty hidden. It's kind of the topography is helping it. It's sort of in the lowlands, surrounded by some pretty steep topography. And this is kind of the only industrial that remains in this stretch of the riverfront. It's currently zoned CBD. And in terms of public use access, it's sort of, it's a little bit undefined now. The intention is for the public access to sort of go along Smith Street, but that Smith Street has sort of got a kind of a lot of industrial use as well. So it's a little bit unclear whether that's sort of going to work out. For hydrology, this is very much in the floodplain. And so that's sort of a concern. And obviously because of industrial use, it's mostly impervious, which is necessary for operations in a lot of cases. So there's a limit to how much can be done to prevent flood. It probably is more likely to be adaptation. And then in terms of the barriers, I've already kind of mentioned the topography is kind of a really strong influencer here of even just people's visibility to the district at all. This last bit sort of rounds the corner to the West Bank and is sort of defined mostly by this sort of continuous historic masonry street frontage, mostly kind of 3 to 4 story buildings. And the flood risk is sort of on the back of each of the parcels. So there's a really dramatic shift there. There's kind of there's pedestrian access, but it's not very intuitive. So that's one of the things, this is kind of a strong desire line for people coming out of the CBD, coming across the bridge. There's sort of a disconnect between people's visual access to the waterfront and then their physical access, sort of not being able to get to the waterfront from this spot. And in terms of development, it's really it's CBD kind of development typology, higher density, zero lot line development. The next piece is this really long stretch that's basically defined by the river and the rail. And this sort of is generally pretty hard for people to, there's limited access to it in terms of the public road network. And so it really functions as sort of a continuous industrial corridor. There's a dramatic topographic shift that aligns with the rail line. So it's sort of a compounding barrier. And it is almost entirely in the floodplain. So again, sort of, has a lot of kind of compounding factors that need to kind of be managed in relationship to one another. The limited public access I already kind of mentioned. There's a little bit of informal sort of pedestrian and bike access that's happening along Railroad Place and Jennings Place, but neither sort of particularly safe or provided for in an explicit way. So that's kind of something to just kind of monitor and think through. And the sort of development, it's really predominantly industrial outbuildings. A lot of the work is happening in kind of open air sort of operations that are kind of not enclosed in buildings. This next sliver is really between the rail line and the first layer of roads, so Harbor Avenue and Commerce Street. This is sort of essentially the transition between the heavier industrial uses along the river and the residential and commercial uses that are in the kind of upland CBD area. Right now it is zoned the same as the lowland area, but it sort of has a different character currently. It's more kind of light industrial uses. And there's still quite a bit of topographic change even in this small area. So that's also something that kind of needs to be negotiated. This next piece is sort of two fingers that basically are currently zoned for the most part industrial, but kind of move into predominantly residential and then CBD areas. So this is a really intense, mix of different land uses that in a lot of places wouldn't be in this close proximity to one another. And so that's really the main kind of open question here is kind of what is the preferred relationship going forward and how to sort of manage those conflicts in a way that, industrial operations can continue as they need to and residential uses are not sort of too negatively impacted by them.
Is that, there's a lot of auto shops there, I think? Is that?
Yeah.
And then
there's also some sort of operational overflow from Divine Brothers. So they have a couple of properties kind of in this section as well. So there's definitely a relationship in both directions.
Okay. I was just wondering why it seems like it's out at sort of a sort of displaced. It sort of goes a little too far inland, from the waterfront area, but that's continuous with somebody else's piece of property. If it's
Yeah, it's also just where the industrial, John, it's where the industrial uses are. So we decided to pull that into the study area.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's also, you're way up on the bluff.
Here you get this little arm jutting out into,
Yeah.
Okay.
It might be a place where there's some rezoning, right, to make it fit in better with what's around it. It's you're way up on the bluff too. If you drive down
the
street there, you're really up high there.
Right.
at the end there, I think it used to be a guy that used to sell live chickens and he'd pluck them for you. You take them home when I was a kid.
That sounds like a nice, relationship to the residential.
Right.
I wouldn't mind having that at the end of the street.
Then at the end, that's you go on to West Avenue by St. Mary's, correct?
Yeah.
Yep, that sounds right. So this is kind of definitely an area where there's currently there is active industrial use there. So it's, we have to be careful about nonconformity and about, taking. So being really kind of thoughtful about how to make that transition. But this is definitely an area where there's a lot of kind of conflict currently, where we'd want to just kind of see if there's anything we can do to kind of ease that over time. This little pocket has some similarity, but it's pretty tucked away. This is really mostly just two parcels, and it has a little bit of residential kind of in this little nook here. And this is similarly, it's kind of upland for the most part. So it's kind of level with the sort of CBD area. And the main sort of negotiation here is the relationship with the sort of open space just here. And sort of there's a little bit of flood risk sort of inlet here that really should probably be managed to sort of limit impact for others that are further inland. It's currently industrial number 1, which is the sort of heaviest industrial use. So that's also something that might want to be revisited. The current use of this area is sort of might be compatible with light industrial sort of zoning moving forward. And then this next section is the waste transfer station, really just kind of looking at it unto itself. This is a really densely used piece of land. They are kind of very tight. They have they handle a lot of volume of waste coming in, and they're looking for opportunities to sort of make better utilization of their site so they can sort of increase their capacity. There's a tight relationship with the rail line and open space. Rail line going this way, highway coming this way. So this is really, it's a tight spot, and there's a big topographic drop off. So this is really about thinking more spatially about how to sort of optimize this site going forward, and ultimately something that really will be sort of the purview of the folks managing the waste transfer station. We didn't want to sort of wanted to acknowledge it in this study. There's also public access here to Oyster Shell Park, which is another sort of point of friction with the sort of heavy industrial use of the site. This next piece is pretty built out. This is sort of traditional mixed use commercial residential, and sort of hugs the North Water Street there as it sort of approaches Oyster Shell Park, and faces on a lot of kind of public and institutional waterfront. It's classic kind of 3 to 5 story masonry mixed use. There is some public ownership, and then the water side is sort of predominantly publicly owned. And now we're getting into the sort of Water Street area. This is, to your point earlier, John, about kind of what's the difference between the two. This is really about the parcel depth, and also the sort of relationship with, so right here you can see the sort of the mixed use district in orange right up against the marine commercial here. And in reality, the use of this first parcel is really relating more to this sort of orange district already. And so there's just some management of this transition that we really want to kind of give some attention to, and think about, how to sort of continue to support marine commercial use on these parcels, given that right now they're mostly, a little underutilized as sort of surface parking. So looking at, what would be needed to sort of reactivate that and sort of make the most use of that going forward. It is like the rest of Water Street, entirely in the floodplain, and the floodplain, unlike a lot of the other areas, does go considerably inland from here. So this is not just flooding of this district in the waterfront, is also flooding of all of the sort of other uses that are inland of this area. So it's kind of a compounding kind of risk or concern. The next street is sort of the heart of the marine commercial. This is largely kind of flatland, very much in the floodplain. This is the area where the floodplain goes the furthest inland beyond our study area. There is very limited public ownership. There's just the sort of, I believe is the second taxing district right here. And then you can see here, there is kind of a boundary here with residential, and then with industrial and mixed use. So it's kind of has some edge conditions that need a little bit of attention, but this is the heart of the operation. So this is kind of thinking of this as an anchor. How can we continue to support marine commercial and explore, what else might be added into the mix to really, keep some vibrancy on Water Street, add some amenities, things like that. And then finally, before we switch into sort of the real workshop piece, this is the kind of residential strip. This aligns with the current zoning district for residential. And basically is sort of a liner. So it sort of, it takes the last strip of kind of marine commercial use and negotiates the transition from that to the residential neighborhood that's sort of inland of it. And the main kind of questions here are around really urban design and sort of land use transition questions of how to kind of, manage the existing, pretty quick shift of land use from residential to the marine commercial. You can see right here, there's kind of the current use here is marine commercial, despite it being zoned residential. So there's kind of thinking that through will be, part of the question for this. And then also this is, as you can see here, this is fully in the flood zone, and the flood zone does extend into the residential area. So this is an opportunity to sort of maybe create a little bit more of a flood risk buffer for that residential neighborhood. And that's it. I'm gonna stop talking for a little bit and we're gonna hear from you. And I'm gonna welcome you guys to jump onto the Moreau. I'm gonna stop sharing for just a moment and drop the link in the chat so that you guys can go there yourself. And then I will also share screen and kind of walk you through it.
It's interesting, right? When you kind of take a stroll around the harbor, like there's a, each of those was a very different story about the issues and the uses from the landslide side coming toward the water. And I think, it's a complicated puzzle.
All right, so I'm gonna share my screen again. You are welcome to follow along with me or to sort of go onto the board yourself and sort of navigate at your own pace to different parts of the board to give you kind of a sense of the board as a whole. The sort of organization here we have on the left, this is that first bit of the presentation that I went through with you guys that goes over kind of how we arrived at the boundaries that we have for the character areas. This section here up top basically has the same exact content that I just presented to you in the slides. So if you want to sort of zoom in to particular districts, you can kind of scroll in and out. And then where we'll be kind of focusing our energy now is this sort of issues and opportunities by character area. So this is sort of like a distillation of some of the things that I talked through. And this is really the sort of the DNA that we're going to use for coming up with the scenarios. So the scenarios will respond to the issues and opportunities that we have identified here. And a couple of just quick sort of Moreau basics to get you comfortable. You can draw with this. You can add a sticky note with this icon. It can ask you what color you want. And you can, in this case, it's kind of small. You can double click in it and then you can type whatever you want and it'll adjust the size to fit. And then finally, you also have this little comment piece, which if you click, it's just like if you were like commenting on a PDF, you can add a little thing and then you click out, it sort of leaves there and sort of collapses itself afterwards. So that's a nice way to, if you're like commenting on a map, this little icon here is a nice way to do that. And we've also sort of created little sticky notes for you to sort of make use of already. If you want to just double click in those, you can start typing. Okay, so I'm gonna bring you all to this map here. All right, so does anybody have an idea of which one you'd like to start with talking about?
You mean which area, right, Zoe? Which number?
Yeah, which number? We can use street names or whatever's relevant for you guys.
Well, if you look at 9 is part of Wall Street.
Yep.
And as you come around the corner to the, follow me to the right, that's headed to Harbor, which is an existing new buildings, office, mixed use, apartments.
Absolutely. Yeah, so for this one, the kind of key issues and opportunities that we had thought about were, one was sort of the disconnect between the visual access and the physical access, people sort of not necessarily knowing how to get to the water, unclear pedestrian and bike circulation in this moment. And there's some potential for high pressure flooding because this is such a narrow point where sort of there's both the riverine flooding and the coastal flooding. And then in terms of opportunities that, maybe we can improve the sort of wayfinding and streetscapes to kind of help close the gap between the visual physical access and explore kind of back of house resiliency strategies. So thinking about the flooding that's happening at the rear of these parcels or the water side of these parcels and how they can plan for it.
In this scenario here, you've got green space right here.
Yep.
And obviously it's not built or developed, correct?
Yep,
So
that's right.
And ownership, is that the city that owns that?
Yeah, isn't that a city park down there?
Yeah, I think it is, John.
Yeah, there's a city park there.
So that to me is public
It's
access,
it's very difficult to get access to.
right? But would be public access if developed properly.
Right.
That's interesting. So the city owns that.
Yeah, I forget the
John?
name of that. I forget the name of the name of the park.
There's
the-
there's Mill Hill Park up here, but I think you're probably talking about another
No,
one.
it's this green strip here. It's on East Avenue.
That's
Next-
Klondike Park,
Is that what it is? Klondike
I
Park?
believe so.
Okay, so Klondike Park
There's no way to access it as of right now.
I
as
see.
of right now, but that could be a good public access point. We're not considering in our recommendations to eliminate, let's say, this boatyard that's here.
No, I don't see any reason why that it's functioning. It's a nice feature. It's
Right.
something to look at. I don't see any reason to go after
Right.
that. I think the main sort of thought here is I think if you think about somebody who's walking across Wall Street here, you kind of have this great view here, and then there's not really any sort of obvious pathway for how to kind of get to the water.
Yeah, but if this was platformed or decked out, that would be a good observation in public access.
Oh, at the Wall Street level, you mean, John?
Correct.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
And people would they could have little summer concerts for the neighborhood, that kind of scenario, which would give it a different flavor. Which
There's a
they
good view from up there. It looks cool from up there.
Right, which they try to do to bring some vibrancy to the Wall Street area. And that would be supported very much by the stores and the like. So
Do any of those businesses operate with back decks, like restaurants or bars that take advantage of that view, or it doesn't look like it,
I
right?
know the boat club may.
No, they have, where is it? They have, right where Coles is, right in the, on the Wall Street area. They have a couple of the restaurants there have a back deck.
I've kayaked up there and it's very tight and it's not even that pleasant from the water. And respectfully, the little parcel of land that's there is one, like you were saying, very difficult to access. The bridge is there. There's no like staircase or anything to get down on that. It would be great to access it, but it's just like a little leftover forgotten piece of pile of weeds.
Right.
And the boat club from the back, it's not very attractive, really. It's kind of ramshackle. It would be nice to spruce it up, but we had a lot of conversations with the planning commission years ago with the redevelopment about sprucing up the park on the other side of Wall Street. And I can't remember the name of it either. Not Scalazzi Park. What's it, Steve? You would remember what the name of it is.
Talking about Freeze Park?
Yes, Freeze Park.
Freeze Park. Yeah, thank you. Freeze Park. And the redevelopment agency was going to spend $1 million and cantilever out over the river. And that idea was kind of, I don't know, shot down for whatever reason. But on the south side of Wall Street, it's like a postage stamp there. It is owned by the city, but
It sounds like,
it's 1,800 square feet of land.
Oh, interesting.
It's not that half of that is in the river. It's 900 square feet. That's not much to work with. I don't mean to, be negative about it, but
Zoe, could we jump to Water Street?
Any last kind of closing comments on this area? I think that's some great conversation around that.
I have one question about that. That's all publicly accessible, the walkway behind the residential building, right? That we see in the plan there. Yeah.
Yes, that's the Head of Harbor project. And adjacent to that, going south,
Yep.
is what is owned by O&G.
Yep.
And there's active conversations going on for them to develop that. They even had conversations going back with people from Head of the Harbor in a joint venture. But that would be ripe potentially for adding apartments and public access along the water.
Continue the
What
walkway
address are you
along.
talking about?
Say again?
What address are you referring to?
It's where the O&G property is, which is just south and contiguous.
That's-
Right there.
Oh,
Yeah.
right, where
Property
that
we're
big-
looking at.
Right, that's cement and crane sort of structure.
Right. It was an asphalt plant. And
Mm-hmm.
they've abandoned the asphalt plant, and they're talking about potentially bringing materials up there, trap rock and sand and the like, to transport from that location to parts in the immediate vicinity.
Right.
But they've also talked about, giving public access going along the river. If they develop it into apartments or condos or mixed use, that would give it a public access flavor there. It could be a requirement.
And then that would connect the different trails that are along some of the newer residential developments then.
Correct.
Yeah, it basically would be the continuation of this here.
Yeah.
So that's something to consider, and it's. I know it's been discussed. What we don't have any control over whether they do it or not, but it might be a suggested reality for them to do that.
And that walkway doesn't make its way around to the city-owned space we were talking about because the marina's in the way, right? There's no way down at the water level to get around there.
Right.
No, but it looks like that path could, if there was a deck built at street level.
Yep.
With pilings going out because there's shortage of land, that could be very nice.
Mhm.
That thing was decked out. No,
Yeah.
not all the way that way, but going south.
On the high, maybe the low,
Where the
there's a
grass
low
is
road and a
going
high road.
towards
Yeah.
the water, right.
Yeah.
Well, that was talked about to connect that entire area along going down even toward the medical building, all the way down, all around the front there. But
Yep.
there was a gap there. They just stopped in the development.
Got it.
Great. This is great conversation. This is super helpful as we're starting to think about.
Yeah, we can go over to Water Street now. That'd be a good idea.
Yeah. So we might want to like take a trip and noodle around behind those buildings at Water Street and figure out if there's a cost-effective way to achieve some of the things we just talked about. That's a pretty interesting area. And
Yeah.
unlike a bigger project, maybe 900 square feet is a virtue in a way because you could maybe achieve a lot without a large area.
Yeah, I think it certainly would have to be a sort of. Sorry, go ahead.
Kayak. Maybe you don't want to do it in the winter, but you can see a lot from the water.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of attractive things that could be done there, and
Yeah.
still maintain the marine use. And
Mhm.
if you're rezoning, and when I say zoning, but zoning with maybe incentives or zoning with, and that would have to do with maybe parking requirements or whatever. It would be nice to see that marine use area expanded because those are depleting resources in every other town. Stanford has done away with them for the sake of high-rise buildings and the like. There's been marinas that have been destroyed and evaporated. Well, in that area, it's saturated with repairs and maintenance and storage of boats for the winter. All these places are very much needed. And if the owners of the properties are incentivized to expand that use and improve their properties with that in mind, and given a little bit, that sandwich shop that you talked about, Tim, a couple of meetings ago, that kind of thing,
Yep.
without overdeveloping the properties. But, that's all well and good, but we're also talking about an area that floods, at a small rainfall.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think that that's sort of the heart of the question for this area, right? Is like what's sort of the right way to sort of leverage the proximity to Washington Street and the sort of the activity that generates, while sort of using that to drive investment back towards marine commercial uses and water dependent uses. So what's kind of what mix might accomplish that? And I think that you kind of see the, marine uses are kind of pick up right here and sort of are pretty strong from there on. And you have the sort of the marine uses happening here, but this sort of midsection doesn't have a whole lot going on the sort of water facing side of the parcels. They're really being using as like a staging area for parking.
And in the border of 17 and 18, you have land that was recently condemned and taken over by the state of Connecticut.
Was that part of the bridge project, John? If I remember correctly?
To a degree, yeah. To a degree.
It was some staging, I think.
That's 68 Water Street. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. 68 Water.
6 and 72, that area in there.
The expectation there is that it's going to be returned to the opportunities for development. So it seems to me one of the questions is there more that can be done to minimize the flooding? And either if so or if not, what kind of development do we want there that is compatible with the flooding that takes place?
Yeah, and incentivizes water dependent uses. It's
right.
I think John's comment about the north end of our study area applies even more here, which is a kind of if then scenario for land use regulations, which is you can do this if you do this.
Right.
And I think Zoe and I have been talking about this. We've been talking with the city staff about this. I think that's the play here, which is, carrot and stick, or frozen carrot, I like to say, or whatever, but to, enhance the water dependent uses, with the carrot being a little bit more development rights or a relaxation in parking ratios or whatever to make it happen. But you've got to do X to be able to do Y.
Exactly. And, we had seen a couple of years ago, not proposals, but opportunities, for example, that might allow for some walkability above the flooded areas, with a walkway 6-7 feet up in the air, attached to development on that side of the street. Some combination of waterborne uses and either some limited commercial or neighborhood uses. If we think that makes sense, how do we encourage it? And how do we, in terms of zoning, how do we designate it?
Yeah. But it's an incentive program. I mean, you have to do the things you're talking about. You have to incentivize the private market to do those for you, because they can also, generate adequate revenue that exceeds the embedded value of the uses that are already on the sites, or nothing happens. And that's the recipe. And I think part of the question is, what's I'm moving ahead before I should, but part of the question is, and we haven't dived into this enough to be able to have a lot of insights about it, but what's the existing zoning that's, keeping most of those properties the way they are? Obviously, the current regulations don't encourage change to happen. What's the tipping point where we get just the things to happen that we want to without giving the farm away? That's a way, maybe a good way to kind of frame, I think, what some of you have been saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
And,
'Cause
you know,
I have
one of the other problems we have over there is those areas that are being used for parking are helping to make things like the Sono Bakery and the nautical store on the other side of the street, for example, workable
Yeah.
because they don't have adequate parking. So we might want to encourage development which would not discourage that kind of neighborhood parking as one of the uses.
Say, I have a question here. About 20 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, there was an enterprise zone all through this area where in order to qualify for the enterprise zone incentives, you had to have a marine dependent use. And my son-in-law at 142 Water Street has a wholesale fish business and it qualified as a marine dependent use. Was that program successful at all? How many properties there are marine related?
Within this particular zone, or you mean the whole
Well,
run along Water Street?
I don't know what the borders of that enterprise zone were, but it was certainly Water Street, you know, the south side of Water Street up
I
in
see.
the 1940s.
And this was in the 1980s, maybe?
No, it was later than that. It was like the early 2000s.
Early 2000s.
I mean, the redevelopment agency people would know because,
Yeah.
you know, they were the ones that were in charge of that enterprise zone.
There's some new buildings that date from that era that might have been incentivized by that, you know, more modest structures. We can look into that though, because I think looking at the track record of previous regulatory tools can be useful, I think.
Some of the
Absolutely.
largest parcels that are there have been in some families for a real long time.
Yeah,
And now you got the inheritors. You know, they're looking for an exit strategy. And
absolutely. We're seeing that kind of generational change happening
right.
in a lot of waterfronts along in the Northeast. Like the kids or the trust want to cash out.
Right. And the developers are banging on their doors and, you know, I'm sure had a lot to do with this study to a degree, you know, banging on City Hall's door to get what they feel they need to further their development that they're doing. So, but, you know, we're dealing with all kinds of other issues as well. And what we need now to come up with to honor that marine industrial zone is to have incentives, like I said, and we discussed maybe parking, less than some of the parking requirements for them, and wind up doing a village type scenario where they put buildings on the properties to induce electronics people to come in there, or marina stores, different things that are going to support the overall boating community. I mean, Marine Max is very much a healthy business. The Rex Marine is a very, very healthy business. Cove Marine is a very, very healthy business. And those are enterprises as far as businesses are concerned. And then you have all the boat clubs that utilize these waters as well, and the services of all these vendors that are there. And in some cases, those vendors have to travel to get to us because they've been displaced from where they were. You can't get to them waterward anymore.
Yeah.
And the whole key to being an active community such as ourselves is to be available water, where you would come in and CTO would bring you right to the guy that's going to repair you. And you have the ability to haul a boat on that property, which they haven't done. They haven't created travel lifts on some of these properties, which could very, you know, easily done and economically be sound.
Can I make a suggestion? Or, the properties number 70 and 68 Water Street, I'm pretty sure that number 70 is the one that has that rather unattractive rock wall. That's just a fake wall. Does everybody
Right.
know what I'm referring to?
Yeah,
That's
it's
the
this one
former
here.
Harrison Gans.
Right, okay, thank you. So that's currently owned by FCNW.
That's DiNardo.
DiNardo, right? So could we somehow incentivize that property owner before they ever decide what to do with it, to just take that ugly wall down? It's used as like a little bit of a garbage dump back there. But one thing that you notice, there are a few trees on that property that probably just volunteered over the years. And if they're holding on to that property for, whatever, to sell 10 years from now, in the meantime, why couldn't it just be kind of passive open space that has green space? It could be a pop-up park for 5 minutes. And, look to the right, they just made this massive parking lot. And we're talking about runoff, pollution, things of that nature, where the lot on the right side is primarily dirt, it looks like. So it's maybe a little bit less
I think that's city owned
environmentally friendly. I'm trying to make it nice for people.
or state owned.
The
I
state
think
owns
DiNardo-
that, right?
I
Yeah.
think DiNardo has on, in the back of his mind, if I had a crystal ball,
No.
I would say that he's planning on putting 100+ units on that property.
Well, I'm just thinking, we're trying to think out of the box and get creative here. And until
Right.
that happens, why can't we let the public at least see the water when they drive by or something? Doesn't Spinnaker owns number 90, the parking lot with the boats and the grass and the trees?
The
along
DOT bought that from him. They took over that property.
But permanently, I'm sorry, I know we've mentioned that before.
Yeah,
Just
portion of
temporarily.
that property is going to be used for the underground cabling.
Okay, well, so then why not make
Just
something
just
nice
to clarify,
on the top?
are we talking about these two? Are
Yeah.
these the two properties in question?
Yes, right here, yeah.
Okay.
And right in between there, in between those two properties, the Eversource is planning to tunnel under in that area right there.
Oh, right along the parcel line there. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Nice
right.
arrow, Zoe.
Yeah.
Bold. Didn't mean for it to be that aggressive.
We're not sure, again, we're not sure of what angle they're going to take or what approach they're going to take. Because as far as the commission is concerned, they don't want them to go underneath, we don't want them to go underneath the visitors dock.
You should look at the
Oh,
plan.
right.
You should. The plan, and Steve has it, correct, Steve, of the new proposed plan. Originally, they were talking of going along the property line. And then
You're
putting in a-
talking Eversource's plan, John?
Correct, and
No, that's not, I'm sorry. It has not been formally proposed.
no,
That was only,
it hasn't been formally opposed and gone through vetting with us and others.
no, they haven't even put it down on paper, John. We approached.
But there is a proposed conversational plan that goes through
Yes,
the property and goes,
Uh-huh.
and they've changed it where it's not going to be on the property line anymore, as you know, because we've seen it. It's going to go so it picks up a different directional to miss the pilings at Betts Park.
no,
I see.
supposedly it's going to be on an angle more toward the Stroffolino Bridge.
Right, and chances are it's not formalized, but it's something to consider in the whole realm of
Yeah.
this conversation.
As far, well, Steve just indicated, Steve, yeah, Vanessa does have the plan. But we tried to get the actual plan from Eversource, and I think Michelle, I think you tried to do that too, didn't you? That proposal from Eversource? And
Yes.
It's for some reason it's not existent.
They're going to wait to the last minute.
Well, that's yes.
Right. Well, I think this is good. Flagged a couple of issues for us to keep kind of monitor going forward. I think in the interest of time, we should keep moving.
Now again, the DOT is still considering putting a bulkhead. Now, I think, who is it? Tammy, you were talking about getting rid of that ugly stone wall, that area right there.
That's on the front. That's on the front of the property, right
You're
along.
talking about in the
Yeah.
front. I thought you were talking about on the waterfront.
No, well,
No.
On
the
the
facade at the
side.
front on
Because
the
that's-
Water
It's
Street.
getting uglier.
This
That's
guy
not-
right
Right there,
here.
that's it. See,
Uh,
Matter
oh,
of fact, it's veneered
that?
with lava stone, and
Yeah.
Harrison Gans used used to sell it back in the 70s. That was popular for a while. So they use that as a showcase for it.
I thought you're talking about on the waterfront side, because that's a violation of their.
No.
Yeah.
They've been in violation for 10 years or more, John.
I know, well, it doesn't seem to make any difference as far as the state is concerned.
Should we move to the bigger section
Bigger-
of the Marina area now, Zoe?
Yeah, I think that.
Because I think we could have
there's
a
some
really
shared
good-
issues, obviously,
Yeah.
but I think that,
Yeah.
you know, if we can distill a couple of the, you know, even just thinking about like dimensional kind of, if we were to talk about lining Water Street with kind of the sort of amenity type development of like the sandwich shop, the bait and tackle store, you know, things that, you know, have a relationship to the water dependent use, but, you know, themselves are more like a retail establishment, more like a, you know, restaurant, more like a, an office, that those uses have, you know, some potential along Water Street, but the sort of main elements that we might want to kind of think through with you guys are, you know, what is that, you know, what is that depth? Is there kind of a sort of a logic to the existing operations that you guys may be familiar with that, you know, we should be kind of considering as we're starting to think about the footprints of those other building types?
Yeah, I mean, I would be good to hear from all of you. Like, what does future right-sized development look like and include that incentivizes getting stuff out of the floodplain and incentivize intensification of water dependent uses? Like what, like hearing a little bit your vision of that would be helpful. I mean, we talked about some commercial establishments. Zoe suggested a couple. Does anyone want to kind of fill in maybe what the vision could be like? We're not going to hold it to you, but it just gives us some good directionality so we can test some things.
So I would just like to suggest that the topography, as you go out the river, you can see the parcels are much deeper. And when you're down by Rex Marine and you're driving along the street, you have no sense actually that the water's there. But the closer you get to the bridge, the property's narrow. So that ugly one that we were talking about, you can actually see the water. And, you know, do we need more apartment buildings there? No, it should be marine dependent use. And if you want to attract people down there, people like to see the water, you know, they like to connect with it. And so whatever it is, the sandwich shop with a water view or something, I think that's, you know, with the marina, you can layer them all.
I'd be off by 6:30, but they're just chatting. So if can you?
You know, it's interesting what you say, because if you think about it, I'm going to try to draw. I'm not as good at this as Zoe is, but if you think about it, you know, let's say there's a basic functional depth you need here, you know, from here to here, which is much more open for boat operations, for, you know, accessing a marina. And then if there's a kind of optimum depth, there is an area of, let's say, development flexibility that could even be deeper on one end, and you know, where the parcels are super deep and get much shallower and only maybe a building depth when you get to the line that Zoe drew between this area and the area we just talked about. And it seems to us that you know, that might be the trade-off, that you can't build all the way out of the water, because that would preclude all of the things that actually happen at those marinas. And then maybe what you also have to insist on in this scenario, and I'll use a different color, and I'll use yellow or something, is that you have to maintain access through, obviously, because you need to get to the marina areas, but those could be shared for, you know, for view corridors too, where, you know, through those gaps you can see the boats, you can see the action as a kind of land use diagram. But you keep that stuff all way back from the water's edge, because once you allow condos and apartments to get to the water's edge,
Well,
the game's over. You
I
can't
think
really
we're
run
gonna
a
have to be, I
marina.
think I'll be very sensitive and careful about talking about, putting, having residential projects within this coastal floodplain area.
No, I'm just talking about, it could
Yeah.
could be in commercial establishments. It's just
Yeah.
things that aren't
Commercial-
there now.
Frankly, Tim, commercial or residential, if we can't better control the flooding, who wants to who wants to go through a flooded street to get to their apartment or to get to a shop or to get to a restaurant?
Well, that's not going to fly with the DEP, because they've already had a couple of projects that they've
Right.
refused to go forward in Stratford and Stanford with these same ideas in mind, because it's adverse to the Connecticut's Coastal Management Act. They even have, even if it's FEMA compliant in a flood zone, to have any residential individuals at risk of, being in that area during the flood.
So that
Yeah,
I think brings up the, maybe the question of, when we think about, flood resiliency measures, they're almost universally very expensive, right? For any business, for any residential, context, it's an expensive thing to do right. And so if part of the objective is to come up with a way of making this district more resilient to flooding, and potentially protecting the inland residential and commercial areas, maybe that's part of the formula that we're talking about here, is like, what would, is there any way that these uses can cross subsidize that kind of resiliency investment? Is there something that's, within reach, or are the kinds of resiliency measures needed just too far out of the price point for development to be able to offset it?
Yeah, and we did this in Boston. We're doing it now in Providence, which is the question then, based on flood modeling and that out to 2070, which is what we did in Boston. What elevation do you have to get to mitigate that risk? And so let's say, hypothetically, I don't know if this makes sense or not, but that area that I've toned in red is fill, and that fill raises that whole area up. I'm going to make it up 2 feet. And based on analysis we haven't done yet, that keeps most of the water on the Marina side and reduces the amount of water that gets onto Water Street, hypothetically. Now we'd have to chase that all the way around.
But doesn't that negate your vistas that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, it's it depends in all these trade-offs what the preferred approach is. There might be a strategy where, and I think
it's also about where you're positioned, right? I think it may mean that as you're driving down the road, you might not have that, through sight line, but a lot of times these kind of, when you raise the elevation, you can also add in kind of amenities on that is sort of like a pedestrian walkway or a little kind of view outcropping where it's for, those who are like walking or biking, that they would have that view there, but it sort of would be in more kind of controlled instances versus being continuous.
And I don't know if this is possible or not, but you'll remember in one of the maps that Zoe showed, and I think you all know this, that flooded area runs pretty far east of Water Street, right? That contour, which is only the 100-year flood, kind of zigzags around. And so is modest development in that zone in a way functioning as a kind of levee that can do more kind of civic good? That's how far back it goes, right?
Yeah, so this is the area that we're, all of this area here is, within the flood zone, but Water Street is sort of the only feasible, alignment where you might be able to mitigate the flood penetration there.
And I don't know, maybe people on the city team know the permitting of the residential project on the other side of Water Street. That was all solved by just getting those sit on kind of podiums, except for the parking that raise everything up, right? That's how those were solved.
Yeah, you see, they're not going to prevent you from building there. They're just going to control how you build. I mean, where Soundview Landing, that's a federally funded project or a portion of it. So it's not like you can't build there. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously there's limits and prohibitions on things you can do, but doesn't mean outright ban on it.
And that's a pretty flat pan, that whole floodable area that's, with Water Street at the center. And it would be interesting to know if with just a couple of modest feet of fill, do you make a dramatic impact? We've discovered some places in Boston where if you just add, 18, 20 inches, you suddenly, all these backlands are suddenly, protected with a fairly simple move. So that is there a cost value, something that could happen there that would mitigate flooding over the next 50 years or so, at least? We can't predict too much beyond that, but I think the other issue is that without, whatever the issues are with the current zoning, there's no development action going on. And on the other hand, the marinas seem to be very successful, right? At least those operations that are taking it seriously as a going business. And the question, I think, for all of us, and I think that you're the experts, is, there's current zoning now that allows property owners to build something. Can we change the recipe and get the outcome I think we all want here? That's the question.
Yeah, so I think on that note, we are very close to our hour and a half marker. So I wanted to suggest I can kind of close us out and get us sort of oriented to upcoming meetings. I'm also.
Zoe, do we have time? You're going to kill me, but is there one other area that anyone here?
There's one other area I would choose if we.
No, is there a burning area that people on the steering committee have one or two things just to tell us that they wish they had? We're going to send you the slide deck and stuff too. So,
and we'll also send this board so you can what we've been doing together, you can do on your own time and add, and we'll keep sort of checking back and looking at, what you guys have to share with us. Cause I know there's a lot of other kind of districts that we didn't go into depth on. So,
right.
Anything before we kind of transition to close out? Any last comments, things that?
The only other area that I would look at is, with a caveat, is that Commerce Street area on the opposite side of the water of Commerce going towards Leonard Street.
This piece here?
Um,
the inland part or the part that's closer to the water?
No, the inland part.
Yeah.
Because you circle around it. Most of that is a light industrial, commercial, and it supports a myriad of businesses in there.
Yeah.
I mean,
yep.
Maybe there's some incentives, and the city's done that at other times, is to help beautify some of these areas to a degree, new facades, updating of the buildings, because a lot of those buildings are old as well. To make it more in character of what could be. I mean, it would be a shame to see those be torn down for many reasons. I mean, it's a higher elevation, has great vistas looking out at the water and all.
Yeah.
But then again, you're going to displace how many businesses that are very viable and needed.
Yeah. I think it's back, John, to the question of which of those businesses are legacy businesses, which ones have another generation or two of life. There's a lot of changeover with those kinds of businesses happening in, Connecticut, New England these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic. I mean, it was one guy had a fairly large piece of property. He didn't own it, he rented it. He was in the welding business, and the kid died too young. But there were people bidding for the welding business because it suits a need that's very much needed in the community.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, I think
we're
that's a great point.
yeah, we have I think we definitely have an eye on jobs, the distribution of jobs, the full job ladder. That's something we're very interested in when we do our planning, that maintaining good jobs at different levels of different trades, different levels of employment. I think that's an important story about water dependent uses too.
Anything else before we do our last closeout here?
I'm good.
Okay.
But there's a lot to digest here.
I know. Yeah, this is like, your waterfront is fascinating. We've been really enjoying kind of getting to know it at the nitty gritty of all these different areas. There's, like Tim mentioned at the beginning, there is a lot of diversity of uses. There's
Diversity
so
is
much
right.
going
It's a
on.
mixed bag. You're absolutely correct. It's just-
Diversity and very eclectic.
Yeah. Yeah. And quick transitions.
Sure.
So I'm going to jump back to the slides here and just close out with a schedule note. So our next step is sort of based on the issues that you brought up and some of the other things that we've sort of observed so far is coming back to you with proposals. So basically to say, these are, for this character area, we think there's maybe 3 different directions that this character area could go in. And that would be what we would share with the public. So what we're intending to do is to come back to you on January 10th and share those ideas, get your thoughts. It'll be much more concise kind of presentation, not quite the same like barrage of information that we're sharing with you now. And it would really be to get your thoughts on those scenarios before we take them to the public. And they will all be framed as alternatives. So we won't be putting forward a single preferred proposal. We'll be putting forward alternatives. So this is not like a final decision-making meeting. It'd be more like, what's the menu of options that we're gonna discuss together.
What time is the meeting on January 10th? Would that be 5 to 6:30 again?
So that was going to be our question to you guys. Is there a time that you would prefer? Is this time good for you guys?
I have something on January 10th that starts at starts at 6:30 or 7, and I can't come beyond that point. But that's no reason why you should, that the whole group should plan around that. But
would anybody else have a problem coming from, if we did it from 5 to 6:30 like we did tonight?
Fine with me. Thank you.
5 to 6:30 is fine with me.
Okay, great. So I think we'll do that then. No reason to have you miss part of it if we can avoid it. So that's the next thing that we're aiming towards, is that January 10th meeting where we'll share with you the scenario alternatives. And then the next thing coming up, which is the reason why we're meeting more frequently with you guys, is the public meeting. And that's scheduled for Tuesday, January 18th. It's going to be from 6 to 8 to make it a little bit easier for people to get to, give a little bit of a buffer from the 9 to 5. It'll be a remote Zoom meeting just like this. And we can talk about this more at our January 10th meeting, but we will need some facilitators and note takers for the breakout rooms. So this is like, it'll be small group discussions, 5 to 8 people probably, depends on the turnout, but and the UTL team will kind of staff, along with the city, will staff a lot of those, but it's always good to have some reinforcements and to have somebody who's sort of helping to make sure we're getting a good record of what people are saying. So we'd love to have you guys participate a little bit in that, but we won't lock you into it until we've had the chance to discuss with you in January.
So
Tim, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. If I could make a suggestion,
Mm-hmm.
When you're giving the overview, for the majority of the time, you had the very large map as the big screen, and then the little tiles with the more detailed photographs. It's very difficult to know what you're referring to on those small maps because you just can't see it on your computer. So if you can switch that and just keep the big map as sort of the small thing and make those individual neighborhoods or streets that you're referring to as the larger one, I think people would get more out of it because they could see better what properties we're talking about.
Yeah, can do.
Thank you.
Michelle, what's the best way for steering committee members to sign up for getting in the different break? It would be nice to have a steering committee member in each of the breakout groups. That would be pretty awesome, actually.
If people are interested from this group, if they just want to email me directly that they're interested, and we can start looping them in and setting up that on the back end with Zoom.
Great, sounds good. Okay, so we will be in touch. Please feel free to, we'll stop sharing so that we don't need to look at this. Please feel free to, take your time with the materials that we shared today. I know we sort of put a lot on your plate. So feel free to make comments and let us know if there's anything else that you think of. And we'll get busy kind of coming up with some alternatives that we can look at together on January 10th. Make sure that we're all comfortable with them before we go to the public. Any last thoughts, feedbacks?
Is the public survey still open? Because I know I've been forwarding it around on some of my email blasts. I'm just curious, have you gotten a lot of responses, and do you want us to send it around again?
The social pinpoint sort of interactive mapping is still up. We will, as we probably around January 10th, we will, take that down and replace it with one that's sort of current with, what we're proposing. So you should feel free to continue circulating that for now. It's still up. We'll make sure to sort of do an e-blast out to everybody when it's coming down.
I think personally, I'm happy the way the process is going so far too. So
it's great. I'm glad.
The more we dive into the details, the less we're sure what to do, John.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, we're all here for the public good at the
Yeah.
end, as an end result. We want buy-in from the city, not just from either developers or people that have a specific end goal in mind. It's got to be what serves the overall Norwalk as a community.
Yeah.
And even people that live up where I live, even though I was a long-time boater and I used to keep my boat at Cove Marina, we like to drive to the water, to the beach. It's got its own great attributes to it. I hear all too often that we don't have enough dock space in Norwalk. Not only locally, but a lot of that comment comes from people in Long Island that would love to be able to come to Norwalk and that are going to other towns because they realize that we are the pearl of Long Island Sound. We have the Maritime Center. We have a myriad of fantastic restaurants and businesses that they could explore. And that's what people who boat, that's what they do. They go to other places to explore because they know their own town. And we're missing out by not expanding our ability to facilitate that need.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. Whatever we can do to expand our marine use, I think is beneficial to the city and our residents.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of the, as usual, the kind of the devil's in the details of like finding that thing that adds up to more than the sum of the parts, right? Is like
Yeah.
when
What's
we're
the
thinking
recipe?
about, what
the
gives that added
magic
benefit to the
sauce.
city and to the boaters, and
How
sort
do
of
we
creates that.
incentivize the market to do exactly what you're all saying? That's the key, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Without overshooting and then killing the golden goose or whatever the mixed metaphor is that I just butchered. I butchered the good golden goose. There, that's a good metaphor.
Perhaps that's our signal to close.
Just as an aside,
Yeah.
my wife loves duck, And every fall, we go to Stu Leonard's and buy as many ducks as he has. Sometimes we deplete his supply because that's the only time you can get them, because they're hunting in Long Island. It's a Long Island duck. And she pays somewhere around $30, $40 for the 2, 3, 4, 5 pound duck. Today she went and they were $99. So,
Sounds like we need some more people to get into the duck business here.
right.
Yeah.
We do have to, on
Time
the
to start
agenda, we did have
upbeating
public
duck.
comment too, so we do have to.
Yeah,
allow
wrap
that.
it up.
Oh,
Yeah.
we have public comment. Sorry.
Thank you for the reminder. Okay, so let's perhaps go to public comment.
Righty,
think
there's
there's
one
only-
person on, yeah. Diane from ENNA is on. If you'd like to make a comment, please raise your hand and then we'll be happy to bring you over. Not seeing a hand, so.
Okay, we can close.
All right, thank you all for your time. And
And we'll send out information on the 10th before we get in too far.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Everyone have a great holiday.
Merry
safe
Christmas,
holiday.
Merry
everybody.
Christmas. Happy
Yep,
holidays.
Happy New Year.
enjoy.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
All right.